The morning sun cast long golden shadows across the still waters of Tawi-Tawi anchorage on June 13, 1944, as the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy stirred in the tropical heat, preparing for what would become one of the most decisive and tragic engagements of the Pacific War. Among the great warships moored in this remote corner of the southwestern Philippines stood the aircraft carrier Shokaku, her name meaning flying crane, a symbol of elegance and deadly power. Nearly 850 feet from bow to stern, she had once embodied Japan's naval supremacy, the very carrier whose aircraft had thundered from her deck to strike Pearl Harbor 2.5 years earlier. But now, as her crew of more than 1,600 men went about their duties, none could foresee that this would be the ship's final voyage, a journey that would end beneath the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the first mobile fleet, watched from the bridge of his flagship Taiho as his armada made ready to depart. Around him lay the last great concentration of Japan's carrier strength, Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, supported by a formidable escort. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, heavy cruisers Atago, Takao, Maya, Chokai, and a ring of 13 destroyers. As anchor chains clattered up through their hawse holes and engines rumbled to life, thousands of sailors stood at attention along the decks, unaware that within a single week more than 1,200 of them would be lost forever. This was not a routine sortie. It was Operation Eigo, Japan's desperate gamble to halt the American advance toward the Marianas, to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a decisive battle, and to reverse a tide of war that had turned relentlessly against them since Midway. The strategic situation in mid-1944 was catastrophic for Japan. The empire that had expanded with breathtaking speed in the early months of the war was now collapsing under the weight of American industry and determination. The Gilberts had been lost. The once invincible fortress at Truk had been neutralized, and now the American invasion of Saipan threatened the very doorstep of Japan itself. The capture of Saipan would allow American B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike directly at Tokyo, bringing the war to the Japanese homeland for the first time since the Doolittle raid. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood that failure here would cut Japan's supply lines to the resource-rich territories of the south and expose the home islands to ruin. Operation Eigo was his answer, a complex plan relying on Japan's remaining advantages, the longer range of its carrier aircraft, the promise of land-based air support from island airfields, and the legendary precision of Japanese gunnery in night combat. Yet by the summer of 1944, the Imperial Navy that had once seemed unstoppable was only a shadow of its former self. The pilots who had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea were gone, lost in the long attrition of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons. Their replacements were boys, many barely trained, some with fewer than 200 flight hours compared to the 800 logged by their American counterparts. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. U.S. submarines had decimated Japan's merchant shipping, cutting off vital oil from the East Indies. The fleet now ran on unrefined Borneo crude, thick, sulphurous, choking the boilers and belching black smoke that betrayed their position. Engineers worked in suffocating heat as fumes filled the engine rooms, but the ships pressed on, symbols of a nation fighting against inevitability. While Ozawa's fleet gathered its courage, beneath the waves another force prepared to meet them, the silent service of the United States Navy. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. submarine fleet, had placed his boats in a broad scouting line known as the NA Line, stretching across the approaches to the Philippine Sea. Their mission was simple: detect and report any major Japanese movement. 4 submarines formed this invisible wall: Albacore, Bang, Finback, and Stingray. But fate would add an unexpected participant, the brand-new fleet submarine USS Cavala. Commanded by 36-year-old Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, Cavala was a Gato-class boat built by the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, only months earlier. 311 feet long, displacing over 1,500 tons, she could dive to 400 feet and sprint at 20 knots on the surface. Her 10 torpedo tubes and 24 Mark 14 torpedoes represented some of the most reliable and lethal weapons of the war. Her 72-man crew had trained together for months in cramped quarters, learning to live, fight, and survive as one organism in the hostile silence of the deep. Cavala left Midway Island on June 4, 1944, for her first war patrol. She crossed the vast Pacific through storms that battered her hull and rolled men from their bunks. At times she dove to ride out typhoons below the surface, her hull groaning as waves thundered overhead. On June 17th, the monotony broke. Radar picked up faint blips, multiple large contacts moving northeast at 19 knots. Kostler studied the screen, realizing with growing certainty that this was no merchant convoy. The pattern, the speed, the spacing, this was a major fleet formation. He faced a dilemma that would test every instinct he had. He could attack now, risking his boat for a chance at glory, or surface and radio the fleet's position, revealing his own presence but giving Admiral Spruance the intelligence that could decide the coming battle. After a brief pause, he chose the harder path. At 9:45 that night, Cavala broke the surface in the darkness of the Philippine Sea. Her radio operator tapped out the message that would change the course of history. Large enemy task force. Latitude 13 north, longitude 136 east. One carrier, several battleships, destroyers. Course 045, speed 19 knots. The message reached Pearl Harbor within minutes and was relayed to Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard USS Indianapolis. It confirmed what American intelligence had suspected, that Japan's last carrier fleet was moving east to confront them. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had begun. Through the next day, the Japanese fleet steamed toward destiny. In the skies over the Marianas, American and Japanese aircraft clashed in what U.S. pilots would soon nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese planes were annihilated by radar-guided American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. But while the air battle raged, Cavala continued her silent patrol. At dawn on June 19th, her sonar operator reported distant propellers. The sound grew louder. Multiple high-speed screws approaching. Kostler raised his periscope and, through the shimmering sea, glimpsed the distinctive silhouette of a Shokaku-class carrier, flanked by cruisers and destroyers. The ship was recovering aircraft, turning into the wind, her deck crowded with planes. The range closed rapidly, 12,000 yards, then 8, then 5. The destroyers zigzagged ahead, their sonar pinging, but Cavala held her nerve. At 11:18 a.m., Kostler gave the order every submariner dreams of. Fire 1. Fire 2, Fire 3. Fire 4, Fire 5. Fire 6. 6 torpedoes surged from the forward tubes in a fan spread, each loaded with a 600-pound Torpex warhead. As the last weapon left its tube, Cavala plunged down, flooding her negative tanks to gain depth. Moments later, the ocean shook with 3 massive detonations. Inside the submarine, men grinned through the tension. They had struck true. Aboard Shokaku, the lookout's shout came too late. White torpedo wakes streaked through the water from starboard. The officer of the watch ordered emergency maneuvering, but the carrier was enormous and slow to turn. The first torpedo slammed amidships near frame 145, ripping open the number 3 boiler room. The second struck forward, igniting aviation fuel tanks and sending flames racing through the hangar deck. The third exploded near the forward elevator, jamming it in place and crippling flight operations. Within minutes, the great carrier listed heavily to starboard as fire spread uncontrollably through her decks. Damage control parties fought desperately, but burning gasoline cascaded down into lower compartments. Thick, oily smoke poured from the flight deck, and men suffocated or were trapped below. Back aboard Cavala, celebration gave way to survival. Japanese destroyers had already begun their counterattack. Depth charges thundered overhead, shaking the submarine as she dove to 400 feet. Light bulbs shattered, gauges cracked, insulation rained from the ceiling. The crew cut all non-essential systems and moved silently in stocking feet. For hours they endured wave after wave of explosions. Water trickled through rivets, the air grew foul, and the temperature climbed above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Kostler used the thermal layers of the ocean to slip away, changing course and depth to confuse the enemy's sonar. Slowly the sounds of pursuit faded. At 1:32 p.m., the sound operator reported strange noises from the direction of the attack, the deep, cracking groans of a ship breaking apart. Half an hour later, 4 colossal explosions rolled through the water, echoing even at Cavala's depth. On the surface, Shokaku was dying. The fires had spread beyond control. Gasoline vapors accumulated in sealed compartments until, at about 2:08 p.m., they ignited in a cataclysmic blast that tore open the ship's heart. The explosion lifted her armored flight deck and sent aircraft, debris and men flying into the sea. Captain Matsubara Hiroshi gave the order to abandon ship, but many never heard it. The carrier rolled to 45 degrees, then capsized to starboard and slid beneath the waves stern. First at 3:01 p.m., secondary explosions rumbled as boilers and ammunition detonated underwater. Of her 1,663 officers and crew, 1,272 were lost, including Matsubara himself, who went down with his command. When Cavala finally surfaced that evening, her air was foul, her batteries nearly exhausted, but the sea around her was quiet. The Japanese escorts had left to rescue survivors or rejoin their shattered fleet. Kostler's men stumbled onto the deck, gasping fresh air for the first time in hours. The captain composed a short radio message. Attacked Shokaku-class carrier. 3 hits observed. Heavy explosions. Believe target sunk. The reply from Admiral Lockwood came swiftly. Well done, Cavala. In that brief transmission lay both pride and relief. In one day, American submarines had sunk 2 of Japan's 3 remaining fleet carriers, Albacore destroying Taiho and Cavala finishing Shokaku. The backbone of Japan's carrier power had been broken. The strategic consequences were immediate. With their carriers gone and air crews annihilated, the Japanese Navy could no longer wage offensive operations. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended in total disaster for Japan. Over 600 aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots lost. Admiral Ozawa retreated westward with what remained of his fleet, while the Americans pressed on, securing Saipan and paving the way for the liberation of the Philippines. For Cavala and her crew, the triumph marked only the beginning of a long patrol. She continued operations for weeks, striking enemy shipping and gathering intelligence before returning to Saipan in early July. There, Kostler and his men learned the full magnitude of their achievement. They had not only avenged Pearl Harbor, they had delivered a decisive blow that ensured American naval supremacy for the rest of the war. Lieutenant Commander Kostler received the Navy Cross, and Cavala earned the Presidential Unit Citation for her first patrol. She would go on to complete 5 more, sinking additional enemy vessels and surviving the war. In the broader story of the Pacific, Cavala's victory represented more than a single sinking. American submarines, though less than 2% of Navy personnel, accounted for over half of all Japanese ship losses during the war. More than 2,000 warships and 1,000 merchant vessels, 5 million tons of shipping in total. By strangling Japan's supply lines and eliminating its remaining carriers, they rendered the Imperial Navy powerless. The loss of Shokaku, the ship that had once carried the war to Pearl Harbor, was both symbolic and strategic. In 1941, she embodied Japan's rise. In 1944, her destruction marked its fall. Today, Shokaku's wreck has never been located. Somewhere in the deep waters of the Philippine Sea, she rests in darkness, her hull broken by the explosions that sealed her fate, entombing more than 1,000 souls. Cavala, by contrast, survives in peace. Preserved as a museum ship in Galveston, Texas, she stands as a silent testament to the courage of the men who served in the silent service, and to the moment when the balance of the Pacific War shifted irrevocably. Visitors who walk her narrow passageways can still look through the periscope from which Kostler sighted his target and imagine the tension, the silence, the decision that changed history. The sinking of Shokaku was more than the destruction of a warship. It was the death knell of an era. The carrier that had once unleashed chaos upon the Pacific was undone by a single submarine, a product of American ingenuity and perseverance. From that day forward, Japan's Navy never recovered its offensive capability. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought across hundreds of miles of ocean, ensured that the next moves in the Pacific would be dictated entirely by the United States. The liberation of the Philippines, the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and eventually the final approach to Japan itself all flowed from the supremacy won that June. As the sun set over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, the waters glowed red with fire and oil. The last great carrier of Japan's pre-war fleet had gone to her grave, and with her sank the illusion of Japanese naval invincibility. Among the many heroes of that day, 72 men aboard Cavala proved that in the vastness of the Pacific, courage, preparation and timing could turn the tide of history. In the words of Admiral Chester Nimitz, luck is often the reward of those who are prepared to take advantage of opportunity. Cavala was prepared, and when fate placed her in the path of the Shokaku, she struck decisively. In a war defined by industrial might and massive fleets, it was, ultimately, the silent hunter beneath. The sea that delivered one of the Pacific's most decisive blows, a single spread of torpedoes that ended the age of the rising sun's carrier. Dominance and forever changed the course of naval warfare.